we're going to be talking a bit about Gatsby and different ways to source content in Gatsby. The focus is talking about headless CMSs and the different types that are out there, running through a couple of different options that you have when you are choosing a headless CMS, and mostly, looking at what's the dev experience, what's the content editor experience for a couple of these different options, and so that's what we're going to be digging into. I use Gatsby because it's what I use in the real world when I'm working with clients. It's a dev-friendly kind of experience. You're writing React code, you're using GraphQL, things you might use on another stack, and it provides really, really fast user experience for the end user. So that's why I like it, and we're going to be using that to kind of walk through just sourcing and things like that in general. So, but I think first you should all stop, like, and subscribe Headway on YouTube. Was that smooth, Jacob? I think that was a pretty smooth transition.
Couldn't have done it any better. Yep.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, Dribble, YouTube, all that. Make sure you follow us to get more great content like this. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and jump in. So using Gatsby, what is Gatsby? Gatsby is a static site generator, which basically means that you can write some code that's going to compile down into static HTML web pages that are able to get loaded pretty quickly, served from a CDN, and then later load in the JavaScript, which is good for SEO, it's good for user experience, it's good for a lot of things. So Gatsby is one of many static site generators. And so the thing with static site generators is that they are more or less static when it comes to data, as opposed to traditional web application that might have a server running like a WordPress or even like a Rails or something like that. They've got a server running in the background that's able to pull in new information as needed. Whereas Gatsby, it pulls information at build time, which means whenever I am done writing some code or done creating some content, I can query that information into my local repo, and then I can push that information live. So the trick with a static site generator like Gatsby is how to manage your content. So I'm going to walk through a couple of different ways that we have for doing that. So the first one is kind of the most straightforward. It's what a lot of like intro to static site generator walkthroughs will put you through, is just, hey, let's just start with sourcing content directly from the repo with Markdown. I know that doesn't sound super headless, but essentially we're still kind of decoupled from the code. You've got your content and then your code. So I'm going to reshare my screen here. And so I'm going to walk through some of this code to start out. Let's zoom in. Can you see that all right, Jacob? Great.
Looks good.
So what we're looking at here is a Gatsby repo. And so I'm using Vim. So if you're not familiar with Vim, it's just like any other IDE sort of, but the files are on the left and the content's on the right. So so you've got in any Gatsby repo, essentially, you've got a couple different folders. You've got your source folder, and you've got your pages, and in your pages, each of these is going to be rendered to an HTML file whenever you bundle. And so what I've got here is a site that's not building, which is a great way to start your demonstration, everyone. I find it's best to hit the bugs up front so that you can show everyone how to solve them. So we're going to do it live. So very smooth. Cool. So basically, Really quick rundown for Gatsby. When you have a Gatsby page like this, I've got my index page here, which means it's going to be rendered at the index of my site. You've got React code that renders essentially a component, and that component's going to return some JSX, some React code that's going to be rendered into HTML. And this HTML is just whatever's rendered here, whatever's returned is just going to go straight onto the home page. So if I can get these red arrows to go away, I'll show you what I mean. The reason it's doing this is because I removed some content from Contentful for later on in the presentation, and now it's complaining at me that it's not there. And yes, I know it's not there. So anyway, so you've got the stuff that's returned here goes straight to the home page, which is there with errors, but that's okay. So you've got the home page here that we're rendering, and basically, you've just got some straightforward content that I've got explicitly typed in here. You've got your hi and your h1 and your tags, and then I'm rendering a couple of links here to my different pages on my site that I have built out. But this is all just very static, very ingrained into the content that I have here, which doesn't work very well for something like a blog post. Even if you are a developer and you're comfortable just writing everything in code, you're not going to want to be worrying about creating a new page with React and all that type of stuff every single time you want to write something like a blog post. So one way of sourcing content is by sourcing it locally here. I've got this content directory, and basically this is just Markdown. And so with Gatsby source local, you're able to, or Gatsby source file system, you're able to source content locally here. I can add some front matter here at the top, and then I can type in my Markdown code at the bottom, which is essentially just a way of telling the compiler how to format my code. And so what that does for me is I can create nicely formatted blogs like this with Markdown all in here. And I can have this to where I'm only editing that one Markdown. I could even open this up in GitHub or something and just create new Markdown files or edit the Markdown right there. GitHub is a great Markdown editor. And so it's super easy to create new blogs. So I'm going to go ahead and create another one right here. I'm just going to duplicate this one. I'm going to do my second blog. Moved it, didn't I? Yep, I moved it instead of copying it. There we go. So we've got my first blog and my second blog. Right now they look identical. If I open this one and then I open this one, they look the same. So I'm just going to change my second blog here to say second blog. I'm going to say second blog here, and I already have an image. Let's make sure I do. Basically, I'm able to just reference here locally in my images directory. I've got, this is my second blog is what it's called. So that's what I'll reference. This is my second blog. So as soon as I've done that, I can go back to the home page and see my second blog is showing up. And the path that it's showing up there is my-second-blog. And that's because that's the name that I named this file, my second blog. And so I can go to that blog now. The images are being very slow, but Gatsby lets them kind of load in slowly if they're very large, which these are. Does lazy loading there, and then it just renders the new blog post right there. So that was super fast. What was that? Like 10 seconds to create a second blog post once you've already got this set up. So what's it actually doing? What it's actually doing is all done here in Gatsby Node. And so what Gatsby Node does is it basically lets you dig into some of the APIs that Gatsby opens up for developers during their build process. And so Gatsby's got this build process that runs through and it generates all this HTML and it optimizes your images and stuff like that. But it also lets you do some cool stuff with whatever data you have. So right now I've got Markdown locally, and I want to pull that in. So we use GraphQL like you do with everything in Gatsby. And you can say, GraphQL, I want to pull all of the Markdown that I have locally here. I want, and then, this is just the structure of the Markdown. So let's go look at what that is supposed to be. The way we do that in Gatsby is by going to localhost 8000 graphical, which is a little interface that they provide to be able to dig into where the data is sitting. And this is super useful whenever you are trying to hook up new data sources and things like that and trying to figure out, okay, I kind of understand GraphQL. I know like the way it's structured, but I have no idea what this next step is going to be, or like where this next node in the GraphQL chain is going to be, or something like that. So I know that I'm looking at my Markdown locally, so I'm going to come over here and say all Markdown remark, and then see what my options are. I know because I've used this stuff before that there's a couple different ways of accessing all of the Markdown. You can go edges or nodes. Nodes is the most straightforward way. And so if I look at nodes, I'm going to be basically, this is going to be returning that nodes object as an array of all of the different Markdown content that I have. And so right now, what I want to be doing with this content is building a new page at a specific path. And so all I need to be able to do that is know what the path is. And so all I need here is the front matter, not the front matter. I want the fields. And the fields are going to be something that's created by that source plugin. And I want the slug. And so I can run that and I can see, oh, okay, sweet. I've got data here. This is a local blog, my first blog, my second blog. All of that's being generated by that Gatsby source file system plugin, which I've configured. And so now I know, okay, great. I can build a nodes field, nodes, fields, and slugs. I can take this and then I can take my results after some error handling. I see the result that I get back here. I can then access in dot notation all of the different fields that I have nested in my graphical there in my GraphQL statement. So I can go results.data. Data is going to be the return from GraphQL. That's pretty familiar if you're ever used Gatsby. Pretty much every time that you return from GraphQL, it's going to return data object. And so inside of data, I've got local blogs, because that's what I named it here on line 11, local blogs. And so now I've got the data that I was just talking about up there. And so now I can loop through each of these local blogs, and I can create a page. So Gatsby provides this create page action, which I can then use to go through and create all these pages. And I create them at path with a component. This component is going to be a template that I'm using to render these files. And then context is the slug. The context is important because that's how, once I get to that page, I know which data to query, because right now I've only queried in the slug, and I want to get the content, I want to get the hero image, I want to get the title, all of that stuff. So I need to be able to pass in that context. And so I'll open up that file really quick, and I can look at local blogs. And in local blogs, here I am. I have accepted that slug in my query, and I've pulled all the rest of that stuff. And so I'm going through all of this to show you that this is the data flow for Gatsby. This is how Gatsby gets data from some other source and into my files. And so even though this is all very, what's the word? Even though this is all kind of in the same repo, it doesn't feel very decoupled. The actual code is decoupled from the content itself. So that is more or less how to source information from Markdown here locally. So I want to next take a look at another approach, which is kind of more proper headless data sourcing. And so we're going to source some data from Contentful, which is a service that's hosted out there. And they basically, they store your data for you. You can go in with a point and click editor and you can pull your data in. So I'm going to hop over to Contentful over here. I've already got a site kind of wired up, but I don't have much content in here. I've got one button that I've wired up, and we'll get to that in a minute. And I've got just one instance of that button. So in Contentful, where everything in locally is just Markdown, in Contentful, we have a lot more flexibility with what kind of data we want to store. If you're storing things locally, you can use your Markdown in different ways and rely more heavily on front matter if you really want it to behave more like a data object with fields and stuff like that. But in Contentful, I can really, in a very intuitive way, create some data over here that can be fed into my site. So I'm going to go ahead and start off by creating a new content model because I'm interested in creating blogs here. I'm going to create a blog. And I'm going to do title because I'd like a title for my blog. I'm going to do a slug because I need to know where to put that blog. Sometimes if content editors that I'm creating this for aren't too familiar with that, I'll say path, and then I'll just create the field ID as slug because that's what I'm looking for. That's what I know it as. And so this would basically mean that whenever I query the data, it'll say slug, but whenever I go in the editor here in Contentful, it'll say path. So I'm going to do that here. Because I'm making a slug, I've got some appearance things I can edit. I want it to be a slug, so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to, back to editing. Well, it jumped ahead of me. I'm going to remove these really quick. You need to omit a field before deleting it. I'm going to refresh. Okay, I've got my blog content model, title, and path. We're back to where we were. Great. Next thing I want to create is a hero image for my blog. So I'm going to call that hero and create. And I'm just going to make that a type media. I'm going to create a new field. And for this one, I'm going to use rich text. Contentful does give me the option of doing Markdown here with this long text. But I'm going to use rich text because it provides me a few other options. So I'm going to call it body. And I'm going to create and configure a couple options here. I want to be able to accept entries, and I want to validate which entries those are, and you'll understand what this means in a minute. And I'm going to accept link button as the only type of entry. Save. Great. So now we have a content model And so now we have to create content to go along with that. So again, in Contentful, it's very point and click. You can say add an entry. I want to create a new blog. I'm going to create that blog, call it Contentful blog. I'm going to put it at path, Contentful blog. I'm going to add some existing media I already have in here, like this one. And I'm going to put in some content. And so my content is going to be very straightforward, kind of expand it a little bit here so it's easier to see. Very straightforward, kind of what you see is what you get. Editor here, I've got a heading 1, a heading 2, I've got some body, I've got a list down here, all sorts of content in here. This is some formatted as code, like a code block there. We've got links in here that are going places. And so one more thing I want to do is add in something unique for Contentful is being able to add in other entries. And so an entry is going to be like another content model type. Theoretically, I could try and embed like another blog post, but it doesn't really make a lot of sense. So I'm going to embed that link that I had before. That's what I was setting up with those content types a minute ago. And so that lets me kind of in a block-based way add in other stuff. And so I can define what this content shape is going to look like here in Contentful. I'll go ahead and publish this. And so I can look at my link button here by going to edit, and it'll pop it over. I can edit the text. I can say where it's going to go to, and it's just going to a local path. Here, you're going to go home to the home page. And so if I know what this shape is, that lets me create a component to go around this object, this content type. And so I've already done a bit of the code over here to in my rich text file. I'll show you what it looks like here, just so that you see. In the rich text file here, I'm going to be taking in all this rich text information, and I'm going to be going through some of the different blocks and inlines that it's giving me, and I'm going to be trying to resolve for my component. I won't get too deep into this right here. This is a little bit of a deep concept, but basically I'm going to be looping through the references that it gives me and resolving my components if I have them available. And so that's what that little reference thing there does for me. So I'm going to go back to my Contentful blog. That's not the right one. There it is. So I'm going to be back in my Contentful blog. I can see that down here, I'm querying Contentful blog. I'm querying title, hero with the image data, the body with that rich text file that I was just looking at. But you can tell my editor is a little mad at me, and that's just because this doesn't exist in the current state of data that Gatsby had whenever I spun up my development server. So what I have to do is restart my development server, which I do with yarn develop. It runs essentially just Gatsby develop. And so if I restart this, the state of data in Contentful has changed. So it's going to be a little bit happier over here. My schema that it resolves in GraphQL is going to be a little bit closer to what I am looking for. But if I go to my home page, I still only have my local blogs. And that's because I am not building these pages yet. And so the pages just don't exist. So if I go back to my Gatsby node, and I look at this GraphQL that I had here, I'm only pulling in information from my local Markdown. So I'm going to open up my graphical. I'm going to refresh it. I'm going to close that. And I'm going to say I want all Contentful blog. I've set up a Contentful source, Gatsby source Contentful plugin, which is going to, at build time, connect me to this Contentful instance that I have set up. It's going to pull all the data in, and then it's going to transform that into GraphQL for me, so it's easier to query on the fly. So if I look in all Contentful blog, we've got those familiar edges and nodes. I'm going to open up nodes, and I want my slugs. And there we have it, one Contentful blog slug that we created over there in Contentful. So the next thing we do is come over here to my GraphQL. I'm just going to copy this, call it Contentful blogs. I want this to be the exact same that I have over here, so I'm going to just copy it. And hope that I delete the right number of curly braces. Cool. So I've got Contentful blogs. It's going to be all Contentful blogs now in my data over here. I want to destructure out my Contentful blogs. And then I'm going to copy this. And for each of these, it's not post.fields.slug like it is here. We've got nodes.fields.slug. It's just nodes.slug. So I can remove this .fields. My pages should build. Anytime I edit Contentful, I will need to, or anytime I edit my Gatsby node, I'll need to restart my dev server. But I also want this to point to the right component, which, as I was showing you before, that template looks a little bit different from here for Contentful to here for the local blogs. It's a little bit different just because the data is different. So we have to build a little bit different component to handle that data. So back here in the Gatsby node, I'm going to change this to Contentful blog, which is not a magic phrase. It is a component that I am pulling in right here, or a path that I'm pulling in right here. Contentful blog, and Contentful blog. There we go. So now if I restart my server over here, see it's even warning me, hey, you changed stuff. That means that you need to restart me. So I will do that. And once I've restarted, it's going to pull that data in from Contentful. You can even see it says here, it's processing data. It fetches the data from Contentful, it processes it, it creates one Contentful link button node, it creates 4 assets and 1 blog node, because that's all the information that I have in Contentful. So if I come back to my home page, it's still not there because I don't have those buttons rendering. So if I go back to my index page, I need to pull that exact same query that I had in Gatsby node. So I'm going to pull that up. Contentful blogs. And so now I have my list of Contentful blogs. I'm going to destructure it here. Contentful pages. I'm just renaming it so that it makes a little bit more sense whenever I'm looping through it. I'm going to use this exact same code that I'm using to render these buttons. And I'm going to say Contentful pages. Again, we don't have fields, so I can just go straight to destructuring the slug. Looks a little bit different. So it is here. It popped up immediately, but I'm going to format it a little bit here, just so it looks the exact same, because this wouldn't feel right if it didn't look the exact same as the other ones. Why don't you like me? There we go. So I did that for two reasons. One, so that I could see that it looked the same over here. And two, because this slash at the beginning is important for Gatsby's local routing. It would have gotten there from this path, but if it's not a slash, it's just going to append it to whatever path you're at. If you put the slash, it goes straight to the root of the site and then goes to your path. So now I can go to my Contentful blog. I can watch this image load in after the page is loaded. And then what's really cool is I see that because I resolved my button, I have the exact same button styling that I have here on the home page, here for this button that I've created back in Contentful. If you remember, I put this link button object in right here. And so this is right here. And that brings me back home. So we've successfully connected content all the way from Contentful through the build process to our home page and to actually build a page. So that's how you source content from Contentful. It's properly headless. My data is over here. My code is over there. I can edit the code and not have to worry about messing up the data. I can edit the data and then push it live, and the code never has to be rebuilt. Most Gatsby build systems are optimized to be able to only change the pages that change whenever you push content live from something like Contentful, and be able to trigger changes. So all of that is super nice for being able to build those things on the fly. So that's kind of a more properly headless setup as compared to that Markdown. But there's a third option that we could do, third style, I should say, that we could do. And that's something like Forestry. And I put here return to Markdown. I don't know, felt Star Wars-y. Jordan on the team would be proud of me for that. So what Forestry does is it lets me, I'm going to go ahead and make a commit here so that I can demonstrate. Cool. So what Forestry does is it actually uses the Markdown content system just like I already used for Markdown, but it's not. But basically, it provides you another way of editing that Markdown and just kind of a different flow for content editing. So it makes it feel a little bit more headless, even though the data still is living and is get tracked and everything in your repo. So I'm going to open up forestry.com or forestry.io and log in with GitHub. And I'm going to add a new site from Gatsby. And I'm going to connect it from GitHub. should have. Okay, must be private. There it is. There's our repo, CMS comparison. And so I'd like to read from the main branch. It's importing the site. And so let's see how little configuration we can do to get this running. And so what it's going to be doing is accessing my repo, pulling in, and hopefully seeing where my markdown's at. If not, I'm going to have to configure that. But it should be seeing where the markdown's at and making a commit back to my repo, which I should be able to look at here in a second, to put in some forestry configuration, to put in just some information that helps it kind of track the markdown templates that we're going to be using. And it'll actually let me create templates from the markdown that I already have. Then it is taking a while. I am queued, apparently. Well, hopefully this resolves here for a second, but basically it'll pull up the markdown that I have in a UI editor. It'll let me create new markdown pages. It'll let me edit existing ones and push those, and then I'll be able to pull them back down here locally and see the changes that were made. If I go to GitHub. It hasn't made any commits to my repo yet, so this part may be, if forestry is down, there may not be much we can do, which brings me to the downside of headless CMSs, and that's that you rely on other people, right? It's a form of a microservice at some point in time. So you know, you've got your data is protected and easy for your content editors to edit on whatever site it's hosted on, but at the end of the day, you know, you're relying on that site for part of your build process and part of your site. So Jacob, I don't know if this is going to load. If it does at some point during Q&A or something, I can bring it back up. But ultimately, that's it.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, yeah, we'll see what if this thing gets spun up or not. But yeah, so if anyone has any questions about anything that Jacob covered today, feel free to share it in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll get it answered, and we'll see if this forestry gets loaded up. But we did kind of have a question about over on YouTube. Selena was asking, he might have missed it. I think I don't know if he missed it in the beginning, but just exactly like explaining what Headless CMS is, and how, and like what are compared to the other options, just like your kind of quick breakdown of that.
Yeah, so a traditional CMS is something like WordPress, right? So you've got a WordPress server that you spin up and you log into, or it's hosted somewhere, and you can access that server. You can go in and add themes and add code if you're savvy enough, or add content, and it's all kind of in the same spot. If the server is up, all of that stuff is being served. If the server is down, that stuff is not being served. Even if it's like hosted and distributed, there's a server or servers somewhere serving your content. And so to that full stack headless CMS, or to that full stack CMS option, I guess, this is kind of an alternative of where your code is decoupled from your content in one way or another. So essentially, we've got your Gatsby builds the code into static HTML, because it's a statically generated site, or it's a static site generator, I should say. And so during that build process, it needs to know where to pull in. You know, if you're not explicitly putting every single piece of content into your JSX, your HTML, whatever you're writing, then it needs to be able to pull that data from somewhere else. So one thing I went through was pulling it locally here from Markdown files, which are in the repo, but they're kind of separate from the code. And then the other option was pulling that in from Contentful. So it will actually query Contentful with your user information at build time, pull that information in, and then put it in a format to where you can use it. And this is the build process, not just for Gatsby, but for basically every static site generator, whether you're talking about Eleventy or Hugo or Jekyll or any of the many static site generators that are out there. They all build their code over here after they've queried information from over here. And so that's essentially what makes it the headless part of CMS, is that it doesn't really care what you're using to build your code. I could keep my content directory right there and rip everything else out of my site and move it over to something like Hugo or Eleventy, and then create new queries, create new ways of accessing the data, and it would all still be the same Markdown. I could connect my Contentful blog to, like if this was a marketing site for a web app, and then I wanted to actually pull references to blog posts into the web app, I could do that from Contentful, and they wouldn't be reliant on each other. The web app wouldn't be reliant on the marketing site being up. It would just both query back to Contentful. So that's what makes it headless, is that it doesn't, they're not interwoven necessarily. There are explicit references from your site to the content, but your content is not reliant on your site being up or whatever. Your content editors can edit stuff even while the developers are, I don't know, fixing bugs or adding features or something like that.
Before we jump back into Forestry, there's one other question. Chris was asking, how does Contentful's pricing compare to other options like Netlify or Sanity, and does more expensive always mean better with these tools?
It's a loaded question. So Contentful is, I can actually just not guess about that question. If I go to contentful.com, the pricing page, they do have a free tier, which can be useful for a lot of people, but one of the biggest limits to it is that it only includes 5 users. So basically that's 5 content editors, including a developer or any developers that you have. So if you've got a team of 2 developers and 3 content editors, a stakeholder can now not join that team or something like that. So for a lot of people, I think that 5 users is perfectly fine. But if you need more than that, the next price up is $489 a month, which is pretty pricey for a web service. It's a powerful tool. It's as you could see during this demo, it was a lot more. It's very resilient. It has a lot of uptime. It's got a lot of features. It lets you do the rich text stuff. It lets you embed blocks right into your code, things like that. It's got an open platform for SDKs and apps. So like you get a lot for the price that you're paying. But when you compare something like Forestry, or you mentioned Netlify CMS and Forestry basically work a little bit differently, but they have the same concept of the content is stored in your code. So they don't need to charge much because they're just running a web app that pulls in data from your site, right? So they're basically just pulling references to the code that you already have, and it's using your GitHub hosted project as its backend essentially. So they do have some paid options for certain things, but they all have a free tier. And so I think what you'll find is that there are more affordable options in the Contentful side of things, like I can't remember the name of the other ones, but I think you said Dado CMS or something like that. There are other options out there. I haven't personally used Dado CMS, but I think that they all have their upsides and their downsides. And I think that finding what matches your budget and your workflow is almost equally as important to budget, I think. And finding how you can make that work for you is the most important thing. Hope that answered the question. If not, pop another one in there.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. I think you can, if you want to wrap up the forestry thing, I think we'll be good. And if there's any other questions that folks have, just share them while he's walking through this, and we'll wrap it up then. So
Cool. Let's see. What does it want me to do? It wants me to set up my sidebar. So I'm going to do that. Repository. I think it looks like it did not find my content directory. Might need to go into the actual config. Let's see, sidebar, add a section. How about I want a directory labeled blog. It's going to be in content/blog. What does that do for me? No results found. No, it's not being nice to me.
yeah, I wonder if there's just an issue on their end since it took so long to even load up before.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to find my stuff. It's possible I have a configuration wrong, but yeah. So generally, you would load up your blog directory here. There they are. They just took a minute to load. So now it's showing me the Markdown that's here in my local blog, but as files here. And so I can do a couple things. I can open them up, and it gives me a nice, I think, a very nice editor here. I'm going to expand this a little bit more. It shows me the information I have about it, and the content I've got. I can make edits to it, here in line. I can undo and redo. I can add quotes. I can add lists, all sorts of stuff that you would expect to be able to do in Markdown. And it shows you here on the left what the actual item is. It lets you type this in Markdown format. So if you're not familiar with Markdown, it's like the hashes are essentially like what your level is. So I did 4 hashes and then a space, and it registered that as an H4 over here. So it's a super clean editor. It lets you see your front matter, which is the stuff that, if I'm looking at my second blog, it's the stuff that's over here on the left, or on the top is on the left over here. And then it's got all the content, and that's what's below the ticks right there for that. I can save it, and I will see that if I pull down, git pull, I'll see it's made a couple of commits here. I'll do my git log. That a little bit bigger. So I can see from the top to the bottom here, my most recent commit. So I can see this demonstration commit was the last thing I did. And then there was an update from Forestry, updated configuration, and then updated content. So it's actually telling me what it does. I believe you can edit the way that this kind of commit registers your information, but you see it even registered my user that made this information. So if you've got a content editor that went in there, made a new blog post and saved it, you can see that me, Jake Aber, went in there and created that information. So you get all the benefits of being Git tracked for your content here. And then another thing I can do is check out my templates. I can say I want to add a template based on an existing document, and I'm going to do my second blog, the one that I was just working on, and I'm going to call it blog post. I can create that template. And here now it's got all these fields in here. And the benefit is that I can create a new blog from that template that I had, and it gives me all these fields. So that's pretty much it.
Chris has a question about forestry. With forestry, do you have to rebuild the site after you update content?
So with everything, you have to rebuild the site when you update content. And the answer is absolutely yes with forestry. When you make a new commit to main on GitHub, whatever build system you're using should be watching main and do an automatic build. I haven't set up a build for this, but I could try. It'd be fun. But that wouldn't, it's not necessarily the focus of this. But yes, definitely for any headless CMS, part of that process is rebuilding the site. When you're using something like Gatsby Cloud built with Gatsby, or I should say, when you're using something like Gatsby, sometimes one of the downsides of it compared to other static site generators has been a little bit longer build times, but Gatsby team has worked really hard to try and optimize that. If you use their build system, which does cost money, but if you use their build system, it's pretty darn fast. I think you can use it for a free tier, but to get some of the really fast incremental builds, which is like, hey, I committed a one-line change to this blog. Can you only rebuild that blog page? It will literally only replace that blog page in the built files, and it could take seconds, if not less than a minute, to be able to build, as compared to, you know, if I was truly not storing a build cache or anything like that, and I was building on something like Netlify. Netlify has optimizations for Gatsby, but if I didn't have any of them on, I could be looking at, if it's a large site, you know, 5-8 minutes for a build. But with optimizations in there, it's usually a minute or less, sometimes just seconds to rebuild your site with a content change. But it's going to be like that with Contentful. It's going to be like that with Forestry. It's going to be like that with Netlify CMS or Dado CMS. Any static site generator that you use will be like that. If you're interested in low build times, Hugo is a great option. It's blazing fast whenever you're looking at building your site, because it's written in Go. Go is a very fast language. This is written in Node, which is JavaScript. And the benefit of that is that it's JavaScript. And if you're a JavaScript developer, it's an easy environment to hop into.
Awesome. I don't know if we have any more questions, so I think we can wrap it up. So thanks Jake for sharing all that today. You know, even though there was a couple little quirks today. Awesome
That's
stuff.
Development.
Yep, that's true. That is. I think that's everything, to be honest. I don't think it's just development. All things in life happen. For sure. So are there any resources that you would share with people for, like, if they're interested in getting started with like any of these types of like headless CMS tools, that you would recommend them to read into and get started?
Yeah, I think specifically if you're interested in Gatsby and using that with headless CMSs, Gatsby has a really good section of their website that is all about concepts. It's a little bit different from like a normal docs section. I think it's really good for if I'm not necessarily looking to answer a specific question, but I'm a little confused about this concept and I want to know more about it. It has these like general concepts, and sourcing content is one of those concepts. It's a great section to read in there. We can share a link to that. I think it's a great place to start. There's also, I think, JAMStack.org or something like that. This headless CMS with a static site generator generally is referred to, I think there might be a better definition of it, but as the JAMStack. And we can share a link to that as well. They've got links out to all the different, there's a ton of headless CMS options, way more than the ones that we've even mentioned here today. And so you could look at those as well as different static site generators.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll be sure to, there is an episode on the podcast on it. That's right. Even Keeled Podcast, if you check it out, we're on Spotify. We also have it on our website. If you go to headway.io and go to our podcasts, or evenkeeled.fm is also our URL, but you'll be able to find it there. Thanks, Jacob. This is great. And thanks everybody for joining us today. We appreciate it. And everybody take care.